There was a time in my life when mornings felt heavier than nights, and that says a lot because nights were already unbearable. I remember waking up before the sun sometimes, staring at the ceiling in complete silence, feeling this strange pressure in my chest that I couldn't explain to anyone around me. It wasn't physical pain, it was the feeling of carrying a life that no longer felt connected to hope. From the outside, nothing looked dramatically wrong. I still responded to people. I still laughed at the right moments. I still told everyone I was working on things. But internally, I felt disconnected from myself. It was as if I had slowly become a spectator in my own life, watching days pass without feeling emotionally present in any of them. And the most dangerous part about that kind of suffering is that it becomes familiar. You stop reacting to it. You stop questioning it. You begin to accept emotional exhaustion as your normal state of existence. I used to think that if something was truly meant for me, I would naturally feel confident about it. But that wasn't my experience at all. The things I wanted most were the very things that terrified me. A different life, financial freedom, peace of mind, genuine love, purpose. I wanted all of it so badly, yet every time I imagined those possibilities, another voice immediately appeared inside me to challenge them. Who are you to believe your life can change? That voice became so constant that eventually I stopped noticing it. It blended into my identity. I carried it everywhere. While walking through crowded streets, while scrolling through other people's successes late at night, while looking at my own reflection, wondering why I always felt one step behind the life I wanted. It felt like my mind had memorized disappointment so deeply that hope itself started feeling dangerous. There were nights when I would sit alone with my thoughts for hours, replaying every failure, every rejection, every moment where life didn't go the way I hoped. And strangely, the mind begins building an identity around those memories. That's what nobody really tells you. Human beings do not simply remember pain, they become shaped by the emotional meaning they attach to pain. After enough disappointments, you no longer say, I experienced failure. You begin saying, I am a failure. And once the mind accepts an idea about who you are, it quietly starts filtering reality through that belief. I didn't understand it back then, but I was no longer seeing life clearly. I was seeing life through the lens of a wounded identity. Every setback became confirmation. Every delay became proof. Every closed door felt personal. It was almost as if my mind was searching for evidence to support the version of myself I feared becoming. And unfortunately, it always found it. What made everything harder was the loneliness of carrying invisible battles. Some struggles cannot be photographed. Some forms of hopelessness are completely silent. People around you may never realize how close you are to emotionally giving up. I remember being surrounded by people and still feeling emotionally isolated because no conversation ever touched the deeper fear living inside me. The fear that maybe my life would never change. The fear that maybe I had already missed my chance. The fear that perhaps some people were simply born for happiness while others were born to constantly survive their own minds. And survival changes people. It makes your nervous system addicted to caution. You stop dreaming boldly because disappointment becomes emotionally expensive. You stop trusting opportunities because your brain learns to expect loss before gain. Over time, you become emotionally loyal to limitation without even realizing it. The strange thing is, I never fully lost the desire for something greater. Even during my lowest moments, there was still a quiet part of me that refused to completely die. I could feel it sometimes late at night, hidden beneath the anxiety and exhaustion, a small voice whispering that life could not possibly feel this empty forever. But the problem was that hope and fear were existing inside me at the same time, and that inner conflict became exhausting. One moment, I would imagine a better future so vividly that I could almost feel it emotionally, and the next moment, my mind would attack the vision with doubt. Be realistic. Don't get your hopes up. You've tried before. It felt like I was fighting myself every single day. I wanted to move forward, but internally I was still emotionally tied to every painful version of myself from the past. What I didn't realize at the time was that my external circumstances were not the only thing keeping me stuck. My inner state was repeating the same emotional patterns every day. My body had memorized stress. My thoughts had memorized failure. My reactions had memorized disappointment. And because those emotions felt familiar, my mind unconsciously kept recreating them. Human beings always move toward what feels familiar, even when familiarity is painful. That realization would eventually change my life, but back then I was still trapped inside the illusion that my circumstances alone were the problem. I thought if money appeared, I would finally feel secure. If love appeared, I would finally feel worthy. If success appeared, I would finally believe in myself. But internally, I was already carrying an identity built around lack. And no external change can fully transform a person who remains emotionally identified with limitation. I remember one particular evening that still stays with me clearly. The room was dark except for a small light near the window, and I was sitting there in complete silence after another disappointing day. I felt emotionally drained from trying to force myself to stay positive. That's the part people misunderstand. Real inner transformation is not about pretending to feel good all the time. In fact, forced positivity can become another form of emotional exhaustion. I was tired of repeating motivational phrases I didn't truly believe. Tired of acting confident while secretly doubting my future. Tired of trying to convince myself that I was okay when internally I felt lost. And for the first time in a long while, I stopped trying to escape my feelings. I just sat there honestly confronting them. The fear, the uncertainty, the anger, the grief of becoming someone I barely recognized. And somewhere in that silence, something subtle began to shift. Not externally, internally. I started realizing that maybe doubt itself was not the enemy. Maybe the deeper problem was that I had unknowingly built my entire identity around fear. Every day I rehearsed worst-case scenarios. Every day I imagined rejection before opportunities even arrived. Every day I emotionally prepared for disappointment as if suffering in advance could somehow protect me from pain. My imagination had become trained toward survival instead of possibility. And the frightening part was how automatic it all felt. The mind repeats whatever emotional story it practices most often, until eventually that story starts feeling like reality itself. I didn't know it then, but I was standing at the edge of a completely different understanding of life, identity, and human transformation. That night did not feel extraordinary while I was living through it, and maybe that is why it changed me so deeply. Most transformations do not arrive with dramatic music or obvious signs. Sometimes they begin in silence, in exhaustion, in the quiet moment when a person becomes too emotionally tired to continue lying to themselves. I remember sitting alone with my thoughts, staring into nothing, feeling as though I had reached the edge of my own mental patterns. There was no motivation left in me, no energy to force optimism, no desire to keep pretending that repeating positive words automatically healed inner pain. And strangely, for the first time in months, I stopped trying to fix myself. I simply observed my own mind honestly. I noticed how every thought I entertained carried tension. Every imagined future ended in disappointment. Every possibility immediately became contaminated by fear before it even had room to breathe. It was as though my imagination had forgotten how to create anything except survival scenarios. I started realizing something uncomfortable that night. My suffering was no longer coming only from circumstances. It was also coming from the constant emotional rehearsal happening inside me every single day. I would wake up already anticipating stress. I would think about money and instantly feel pressure in my body. I would think about relationships and immediately expect abandonment or disappointment. Even when nothing bad was actively happening, my nervous system behaved as if danger was always near. And when the body lives in that state long enough, fear stops feeling temporary. It begins feeling like personality. I had spent so much time identifying with anxiety, uncertainty, and emotional exhaustion that I unconsciously started calling those experiences myself. That realization hit me harder than any motivational advice ever had. Because if identity shapes perception, then maybe I had been unconsciously recreating the same emotional life over and over again without realizing it. I began questioning why my mind automatically moved toward worst case outcomes. Why did I trust fear more than possibility? Why did painful memories feel more believable than hopeful visions of the future? The answer slowly became clear. The mind believes what it repeatedly experiences emotionally. Human beings are deeply conditioned by repetition. The brain builds familiarity through emotional patterns, not just logic. If a person spends years emotionally rehearsing failure, rejection, stress, or hopelessness, those states eventually begin feeling normal. And anything outside that emotional normality can start feeling unrealistic, even if it is healthy. That explained why positive change felt uncomfortable to me. It wasn't because change was impossible. It was because my identity had become emotionally attached to struggle. My mind knew how to survive disappointment better than it knew how to receive peace. For the first time, I understood the deeper meaning behind the idea that imagination shapes reality, not in some exaggerated fantasy way, but psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. Whatever a person consistently identifies with internally begins influencing how they perceive the world, how they respond to opportunities, how they interpret events, and how they carry themselves through life. The inner world quietly becomes a filter through which external reality is experienced. I saw this clearly when I looked back at my own patterns. Whenever something good happened, I expected it to disappear. Whenever an opportunity appeared, I immediately imagined failure. Whenever I felt inspired, another voice inside me warned me not to get too hopeful. My mind was not protecting me. It was imprisoning me inside emotional familiarity. That realization created something unexpected inside me, awareness. And awareness changes everything. Because once you begin observing your inner patterns consciously, you can no longer completely identify with them. I started noticing how often I mentally argued for my own limitations. I noticed how I spoke to myself in moments nobody else could hear, the quiet comments, the invisible assumptions, the constant emotional language of defeat running beneath my daily life. It was subtle but powerful. People like me don't succeed. Things never work out fully. I'll probably disappoint myself again. Those thoughts had repeated so often that they no longer sounded negative to me. They sounded factual. That is how conditioning works. The mind turns repetition into identity, and identity silently shapes behavior. What frightened me most was realizing that I had spent years waiting for external proof before allowing myself to emotionally change. I told myself I would feel secure once circumstances improved. I would feel worthy once someone loved me. I would feel confident once success arrived. But that way of living keeps a person emotionally dependent on the outside world, and the outside world changes constantly. That means peace always remains fragile. I started understanding that true transformation had to begin internally first, before evidence appeared. Not because reality should be denied, but because the emotional state a person repeatedly occupies eventually influences the choices, perceptions, and behaviors that shape their future. The inner world was not separate from life. It was participating in the creation of it every single day. At first, practicing a different inner state felt unnatural, almost uncomfortable. When I tried imagining myself calm, fulfilled, or secure, my mind immediately resisted. Fear would appear, doubt would appear, old memories would appear. My nervous system reacted as though unfamiliar hope itself was dangerous. And honestly, that was difficult to accept. I thought transformation would feel inspiring all the time, but often it felt emotionally disorienting. I was confronting a version of myself that had existed for years, a self built around caution, disappointment, and emotional self-protection. Letting go of that identity felt almost like grieving, because even painful identities become familiar companions after enough time. The mind clings to what it knows, even when what it knows is suffering. Still, something inside me refused to completely return to the old patterns. I started experimenting quietly with a new way of thinking and feeling. Not forced positivity, not denying reality, but intentionally returning my attention toward the version of myself I wanted to become, instead of constantly worshipping the version I feared remaining. I began asking different questions internally. What would life feel like if I no longer saw myself as broken? What if my current circumstances were not permanent reflections of my identity? What if fear was simply old conditioning reacting to change? Those questions softened something inside me. For the first time in a long while, possibility stopped feeling completely unreachable. And little by little, my relationship with my own mind began changing. I stopped treating every fearful thought as absolute truth. I stopped assuming every doubt predicted failure. I started realizing that thoughts are often echoes of past conditioning, not accurate prophecies about the future. That understanding created space within me, space between awareness and reaction. Instead of instantly collapsing into hopelessness every time fear appeared, I began observing it, listening to it without fully surrendering to it. And in that space, something new quietly started emerging, a different sense of self that had nothing to do with pretending life was perfect and everything to do with no longer emotionally identifying with limitation as deeply as before. What nobody prepares you for is the strange loneliness that appears when you begin changing internally, while your external life still looks exactly the same. That was the hardest part for me, not the techniques, not the visualizations, not even the uncertainty about the future. The hardest part was waking up every morning inside the same reality while trying not to emotionally return to the same identity. Because the moment you decide to stop identifying with fear, the old version of you does not disappear quietly. It fights for survival. I could feel that battle constantly inside my own mind. One part of me wanted to move toward a different life with trust, openness, and emotional certainty, while another part kept dragging me back toward familiar hopelessness. Some days I genuinely felt inspired, connected to possibility, almost peaceful inside. Then suddenly, one bad moment, one delay, one unexpected problem would pull me straight back into old emotional patterns. And in those moments, it felt as if the past was trying to reclaim me. There were mornings where I would sit quietly, trying to imagine a better future for myself, only for another voice inside me to whisper, "You're just setting yourself up for disappointment again." That voice sounded rational, careful, protective, but eventually I realized it was not protecting me from pain. It was protecting the old identity from change. Human beings become emotionally attached to familiar versions of themselves, even painful ones. The mind wants consistency more than happiness. If you have spent years identifying as unsuccessful, unloved, anxious, or stuck, then suddenly imagining yourself powerful, secure, or fulfilled can create internal resistance. The nervous system reacts to unfamiliar emotional states almost the same way it reacts to danger. That explained why I sometimes felt fear while trying to grow. My body was interpreting change as uncertainty, and uncertainty often feels threatening to the brain. There were moments during that period where I almost gave up on the entire process, not because nothing was happening externally, but because the emotional battle itself became exhausting. Every time I tried to emotionally move toward a new identity, old memories resurfaced. Every rejection, every failure, every moment that once convinced me I was not enough. It was as though my subconscious mind kept presenting evidence for why I should remain the same person I had always been. And honestly, sometimes I believed those thoughts again. Sometimes fear felt more convincing than possibility. Sometimes I would look at my life and think, maybe this really is all I'm capable of. That is the dangerous thing about prolonged disappointment. It trains the mind to lower its expectations in order to avoid future pain. People do not always stop dreaming because they are weak. Sometimes they stop because their nervous system becomes exhausted from carrying hope without visible evidence. But even during those difficult moments, something inside me had started changing too deeply to fully return to the old way of thinking. I noticed that although fear still appeared, I no longer completely surrendered to it automatically. There was now an awareness observing the fear, a quieter voice beneath the panic reminding me that thoughts are not always truths. Sometimes they are simply repetitions of old emotional conditioning. That realization changed the way I experienced doubt. Before, doubt felt like proof that transformation was impossible. Now, I slowly began seeing doubt as resistance created by the old identity losing emotional control. And strangely, that made the process feel more human. I stopped expecting myself to feel perfectly confident all the time. I stopped believing that fear meant failure. Instead, I began understanding that emotional growth often includes tension between who you have been and who you are becoming. The battle became especially intense whenever life tested me externally. Bills still had to be paid, certain relationships still felt painful, some opportunities still disappeared unexpectedly. There were days where reality seemed determined to pull me back into hopelessness. And those moments revealed something important about identity. Most people do not react to life based only on what happens. They react based on who they believe they are. The old version of me interpreted every setback as personal confirmation that nothing would ever change. But the newer version I was slowly building inside myself started responding differently. Instead of instantly collapsing emotionally, I began pausing, observing, questioning the automatic assumptions my mind created. Does this moment truly define my future? Am I reacting from present awareness or from old emotional memory? Those questions interrupted patterns that once controlled me unconsciously. What surprised me most was how small the internal shifts seemed at first. There was no dramatic overnight transformation, no sudden explosion of confidence. It happened quietly, almost invisibly. I started noticing that I recovered from negative moments faster than before. I stopped spending entire days emotionally drowning in overthinking after one disappointment. I became more aware of the stories I repeated about myself internally. And slowly, my attention started shifting away from constantly analyzing what was wrong with my life toward imagining who I could become beyond my current circumstances. That shift changed something subtle but powerful inside me. Because wherever attention repeatedly goes, emotional energy follows, and emotional energy eventually shapes identity. I also began realizing how deeply perception influences experience. When a person expects rejection, they unconsciously notice signs of rejection everywhere. When a person expects failure, their body carries hesitation into opportunities before anything even happens. The mind constantly searches for evidence that confirms existing beliefs. That understanding forced me to confront how often I had unknowingly participated in maintaining my own hopelessness. Not intentionally, but emotionally. I had spent years rehearsing defeat internally and then wondering why confidence felt unnatural. But confidence is not always something people magically have. Often it is the result of repeatedly identifying with a different internal state until the nervous system gradually accepts it as familiar. There were nights during that period where I still felt completely uncertain about the future. I still questioned myself. I still worried that maybe I was fooling myself by believing life could change. But despite all of that, I kept returning emotionally to the person I wanted to become, again and again, sometimes gently, sometimes desperately. I kept imagining a version of myself that no longer lived in constant fear, a version of myself capable of peace even before circumstances became perfect, a version of myself who no longer measured worth through temporary failures. And although nothing dramatic happened immediately, something deeper was occurring beneath the surface. My identity was slowly loosening its attachment to the past. That process felt less like becoming someone completely new and more like remembering parts of myself fear had buried for years. strength, openness, trust, emotional resilience. Those qualities had not disappeared from me. They had simply been covered by layers of conditioning, disappointment, and survival thinking. And the more I stopped emotionally worshipping my old limitations, the more space those forgotten parts of me began reclaiming inside my life. The strange thing about transformation is that while you are living through it, it rarely feels dramatic. Most of the time it feels ordinary, quiet, almost invisible. I used to think life-changing moments would arrive like lightning, sudden and undeniable, but what actually happened was far more subtle than that. The impossible thing I once obsessed over did not appear overnight like some fantasy. It emerged gradually through a chain of internal shifts that slowly altered the way I saw myself, the way I responded to life, and the way life eventually responded back to me. Looking back now, I can see that the external changes began long before visible results appeared. They started the moment I stopped emotionally identifying with hopelessness as deeply as before. That was the real beginning, even though at the time nothing around me looked different yet. One of the first things that changed was my relationship with uncertainty. Before, uncertainty used to terrify me because I interpreted it as danger. If I could not see immediate proof that things were improving, my mind instantly assumed failure was coming. But as my inner state slowly shifted, I noticed that I stopped reacting to uncertainty with the same emotional panic. I began allowing possibility to exist without demanding instant evidence. That changed my behavior in ways I did not initially recognize. I started speaking differently during conversations. I stopped carrying the same defeated energy into opportunities. I became more open, more present, less emotionally guarded. Fear still existed sometimes, but it no longer completely controlled my decisions. And when fear stops controlling a person's behavior, life begins opening in unexpected ways. The opportunities themselves were not magical. That is important to understand. They often looked small at first. A conversation I normally would have avoided. An idea I finally acted on instead of overthinking for weeks. A chance encounter that later became meaningful. Tiny moments that the old version of me would have ignored because I was too emotionally trapped inside limitation to notice them. That is what fascinated me most once I began reflecting on the process. Reality did not suddenly become different overnight. My perception became different first, and perception changes everything. The human mind filters experience according to identity. When you emotionally identify with defeat, you unconsciously overlook possibilities because your attention is trained toward problems. But when your inner state changes, your awareness expands. You begin noticing doors that were always there, but your old mindset could not emotionally recognize them. I remember one particular moment where I caught myself reacting differently than I would have months earlier. Something unexpected went wrong, the kind of situation that previously would have sent me spiraling into anxiety for days. But this time, although I still felt stress, I noticed another feeling underneath it: stability. Not perfect confidence, but emotional steadiness. For the first time in years, I did not immediately interpret difficulty as proof that my future was collapsing. That moment stayed with me because it revealed how deeply my identity had already begun changing internally. Transformation is not only visible in what you achieve, it is visible in what no longer emotionally destroys you. As weeks passed, life slowly started reflecting back the internal shifts I had been practicing privately. Certain relationships improved naturally because I stopped approaching people from constant insecurity. Opportunities appeared because I became more willing to participate instead of assuming failure in advance. My thinking became clearer because fear was no longer consuming all of my mental energy. Even my body felt different at times, lighter, more open, less trapped in survival mode. It was as if my nervous system was slowly learning that life did not have to be experienced through constant emotional defense. And perhaps the most surprising part was realizing that the external results I once desperately chased were now arriving as side effects of becoming someone emotionally different inside. There was still doubt during this period. And that is something I wish more people understood. Doubt did not suddenly disappear just because progress started happening. There were still nights where old fears returned, still moments where uncertainty whispered familiar thoughts into my mind. But the difference was that I no longer treated those thoughts as commands. I no longer believed every fearful emotion represented truth. That changed the entire experience of transformation. Before, fear would instantly pull me back into old identity patterns. Now fear became something I could observe without fully surrendering to it. And that emotional separation gave me power I never had before. Because when a person stops identifying completely with fear, they stop allowing temporary emotions to define permanent identity. What eventually manifested in my life was not only external success, it was internal freedom. The impossible thing I once longed for became real, yes, but by the time it arrived, I realized something unexpected. The external result itself was no longer the most valuable part of the journey. The person I had become while moving toward it mattered more, because the old version of me would not have been able to sustain the life I desired anyway. That version was too emotionally dependent on fear, validation, and worst-case thinking. The process had to transform me internally first, not into someone perfect, but into someone capable of holding a different reality without immediately sabotaging it through old emotional patterns. I began understanding why inner states matter so deeply. Human beings are always expressing who they believe themselves to be, often without realizing it. Identity quietly shapes posture, decisions, reactions, tone of voice, risk tolerance, emotional resilience, and perception. A person who sees themselves as powerless unconsciously behaves differently than someone who internally believes life is still unfolding in their favor. And over time, those subtle differences compound into completely different lives. That realization changed how I viewed manifestation entirely. It was never about forcing reality to obey every thought. It was about understanding that consciousness, emotion, and identity participate in shaping human experience more deeply than most people realize. The most beautiful part of the process was discovering that life did not need me to become fearless before things could change. It only required that I stop returning fully to the old version of myself every time fear appeared. That alone changed my direction. Every time I chose not to emotionally collapse back into hopelessness, I strengthened a different identity within me. Every time I imagined possibility instead of rehearsing disaster, I weakened years of conditioning little by little, and eventually those internal repetitions became more powerful than the old emotional patterns that once controlled my entire life. What once felt impossible slowly became natural. Not because reality suddenly became perfect, but because I was no longer emotionally chained to the identity that believed nothing good could happen for me. And once that internal attachment weakened, life itself began moving differently around me.